Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and on a very busy news day, I'm joined by Ash Sarkar. Ash, have you been glued to your screen listening to Donald Trump's inauguration speech?
I have been, but I don't think that any of the analysis that I can give you will be half as good nor nearly as entertaining as Aaron's Donald Trump impression. So just saying to the viewers, hold tight to when Aaron's back on the show and know that he's more fun.
Well, I'm thinking now Trump is back for another 4 years. I'm going to try and, I don't know, enroll on some kind of course where they teach you how to, because I just feel so inadequate because Aaron can do it and I can't. Sometimes I do it off camera and people say, definitely don't do that on camera because I just can't do it. But we've got 4 years to practice, but we might as well get it down soon. Tonight's show is so busy. We're not just talking about Trump's inauguration. We're also Gaza, ceasefire, Axel Raducanu pleading guilty to the horrific murder of 3 young girls. That was the Southport killings, of course. And this would normally be really the top story on a show, but there's so much else to talk about. This is going on at the end. Corbyn and McDonnell, that's Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, have been interviewed under caution after a pro-Palestine march. Tells you something that's our last story this evening. Donald Trump was today inaugurated for the second time. Some were expecting him to have a sunnier disposition this time around compared to 2017. But I have to say, he still sounded fairly angry.
My recent election is a mandate to completely and totally reverse a horrible betrayal and all of these many betrayals that have taken place, and to give the people back their faith, their wealth, their democracy, and indeed their freedom. From this moment on, America's decline is over.
So the really memorable line from Trump's inauguration address at the beginning of 2017 was to talk about American carnage. And people back then thought that was really shocking because normally, your inauguration speech, you've just won the presidency. You're supposed to sort of talk about how great America is and how sunny the next 4 years are going to be. Some people thought that Donald Trump might be moving to that this time around. I don't think he did, right? It was very, very negative. And he also had some especially strong criticisms for the previous administration.
As we gather today, our government confronts a crisis of trust. For many years, a radical and corrupt establishment has extracted power and wealth from our citizens while the pillars of our society lay broken and seemingly in complete disrepair. We now have a government that cannot manage even a simple crisis at home, while at the same time stumbling into a continuing catalog of catastrophic events abroad. It fails to protect our magnificent, law-abiding American citizens, but provides sanctuary and protection for dangerous criminals, many from prisons and mental institutions that have illegally entered our country from all over the world. We have a government that has given unlimited funding to the defense of foreign borders, but refuses to defend American borders or, more importantly, its own people.
So he still sounds in campaigning mode, right? Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, by the way, are there in the room. It's supposed to be this very traditional event where you all say sort of how we're all kind of on the same team. We all want America to be brilliant, but I just won the last election. No, he's like, these people are scum, essentially, is kind of what he's saying there. Donald Trump, as you'd expect, also brought up the assassination attempt that was made against him during the campaign.
Those who wish to stop our cause have tried to take my freedom and indeed to take my life. Just a few months ago in a beautiful Pennsylvania field, an assassin's bullet ripped through my ear. But I felt then, and believe even more so now, that my life was saved for a reason. I was saved by God to make America great again.
He was saved by God. Although, I mean, you can see how you might get some sort of messianic tendencies if you have survived an assassination attempt, which did get close to killing the guy, right? Also, of course, you'll notice the inauguration address is inside. It's inside the rotunda. Normally, it's outdoors. The official reason it wasn't outdoors this time is because of very cold weather. And to be fair, it was -4 degrees. Some people have been speculating whether or not he was worried of a repeat of 8 years ago when the crowd wasn't as big as he wanted it to be, and then he had to tell loads of lies afterwards. Other suggestions that maybe there were security concerns of having it outside. But again, it was -4, so maybe we can just take them at their words. The big difference, though, between this inauguration and the last one was that Trump, this time around, announced a lot of policies. So it's been reported that Trump has 100 executive orders planned over the coming days. And these are some of the issues he listed during his speech.
First, I will declare a national emergency at our southern border. All illegal entry will immediately be halted, and we will begin the process of returning millions and millions of criminal aliens back to the places from which they came. The inflation crisis was caused by massive overspending and escalating energy prices, and that is why today I will also declare a national energy emergency. We will drill, baby, drill. As of today, it will henceforth be the official policy of the United States government that there are only two genders, male and female.
Now, because I don't actually know what it's going to mean in practice to sort of say that that is the policy of the United States government, because that's kind of a philosophical belief. But of course, it will be very worrying to trans people to hear that, because it's clear what Trump is getting at. In terms of drill, baby, drill, obviously very worrying. We've just seen a number of natural disasters in the United States, which were clearly intensified by climate change. And now you've got a president saying we're going to drill, baby, drill. There's an energy emergency. Of course, very worrying in terms of how climate politics can work. I've spoken a lot about this on this show. The idea of deporting millions and millions of foreign criminals. I don't know if there are that many foreign criminals for him to deport. The phrase millions of deportations means you're going to be deporting kind of anyone you can find. So again, that's going to be scary for lots of people living in the United States. Trump restated his plan to rename the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, so talking about his foreign policy. He also reiterated his opposition to the Panama Canal being given back to Panama. But he was also clear his ambitions were not just limited to the terrestrial.
The United States will once again consider itself a growing nation, one that increases our wealth, expands our territory, builds our cities, raises our expectations, and carries our flag into new and beautiful horizons. And we will pursue our manifest destiny into the stars, launching American astronauts to plant the stars and stripes on the planet Mars.
Now, if you were watching the live speech, it then cut to Elon Musk in the audience, of course, now part of the Trump administration, looking very goofy and sort of putting his thumbs up. So clearly that's what he wants to see. Whether or not we're going to get to Mars in the next 4 years, I'm unconvinced. I think Elon Musk does think we will. I'm sure Trump would like that moment to have the American flag put on a new planet under his presidency. Ash, so much to talk about here. I want to get your initial thoughts on what we've seen today.
Well, I think there's a few things to talk about. The first is saying that American decline is over. Now, if you want to talk about things which, if not unify the electorate across party lines, but are maybe shared emotional affects, that sense of societal decline is pretty much felt by everyone, apart from Democrat surrogates who were appearing on MSNBC and CNN during the election to say, actually, the economy is good because line goes up. So that's the one thing where you can almost position Donald Trump as a unifier. As for the other items, in particular, the executive orders, the direction of the military to the southern border, declaring a national emergency, I think that tells you something about the direction of travel. If during the Trump presidency 1.0, he didn't care about either the legality or the optics or the human rights impact of separating families at the border, that gives you a sense that he's likely to go even further this time around. In terms of what's been signaled by sources close to the Trump camp, that might include large-scale immigration raids of workplaces and residential properties as well. So really, you're looking at whole families potentially being swept up in immigration raids. And the second thing, which I think is important, is this sense of, or not the sense, the statement that the US will only recognize legally two genders, male and female. Someone put it in a really on the nose, I think, succinct way. A journalist by the name of Talman Joseph, I believe he's an economics reporter for the New York Times. And what he said was that the sort of, 2010s, 2020s era of woke really achieved very little. All of woke's gains, insofar as you could say that it made any, were all cultural and representative. It was all about rhetoric. It was all about what you could see on TV. It really didn't have much of a material impact, if any material impact, on the lives of people who are from identity minorities, whether it's ethnic minorities or whether it's gender minorities, such as transgender people. But the backlash is likely to have material impacts. So what the matter of legal recognition could mean is that it could impact the way in which anti-discrimination measures are interpreted. It could impact safeguards in terms of, safeguarding access to single gender spaces, safeguarding access to, healthcare for trans people, and in particular trans youth. And it may also have impacts in terms of what kind of legal documentation transgender people are able to obtain for their status. So I think that was an interesting observation by this New York Times reporter, the fact that woke's gains weren't material at all, but the backlash against it has the potential to significantly impact and impair the ability of trans people to just lead normal lives.
I want to talk about one other aspect of this inauguration. I mean, we're going to speak about more than one other aspect, but I want to move on to another one, which is another difference between this inauguration and the one, I suppose, 8 years ago now, is who attended, the guests. So amongst the guests at Trump's inauguration were all the politicians, celebrities and officials you'd expect to see. But there was also a class of people there who usually like to keep a somewhat lower profile, tech billionaires. So anticipating lower regulation, greater power, and of course an increase to their fortunes under Trump, they were out in force. It's no surprise that X and Tesla CEO Elon Musk was there, given he's been picked to head up Trump's Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. He's pictured here with Google CEO Sundar Pichai, as well as Amazon founder and former CEO Jeff Bezos. Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg was seen mingling with Trump's pick for Secretary of State Marco Rubio in a nod to Trump's decision to stall the Biden administration's TikTok ban. Billionaire CEO of the video platform Xu Zhi made an appearance too. And OpenAI's Sam Altman was there as well, seen here chatting to YouTubers Jake Paul and Logan Paul, YouTubers and boxers or wrestlers. I'm never sure what they're posing as nowadays. Meanwhile, representing the old media guard, newlywed Rupert Murdoch made an appearance too. I didn't know who's newlywed again. Oh dear. Ash, I suppose this is a big part of this story of the vibe shift everyone keeps talking about in America. So when it came to the 2017 inauguration, yes, Donald Trump had won the presidency, but he hadn't won the popular vote. He was seen as a bit of an aberration. Obviously, there were huge mobilizations, huge demonstrations. And when he tried to sort of introduce his executive orders, such as the Muslim ban, and protests were quite muted. Also, you saw, corporate elites really kind of avoiding him because they thought, if this is an aberration, we don't want to align with Donald Trump because that could damage our sort of standing with our customers. Now, everyone seems to be saying, okay, Donald Trump, he's the legitimate president. We're not treating him like an abnormality anymore. Our businesses are going to cozy up to him, and let's all get on board with this. Do you think that's going to matter in terms of, I suppose, his ability to push through some of the executive orders you were discussing earlier?
Well, the first thing to point out about Donald Trump is that he's incredibly self-serving. So when it came to the TikTok ban, which was originally his idea, don't forget, Donald Trump used to be in favor of supporting TikTok. I think the reason why he changed his mind on it is that it became a sort of Democrat and Republican old guard project, as it made its way through the House. And it became an opportunity for Trump to position himself as not just a protector of free speech, but someone who's looking out for Gen Z and the Zoomers. The fact that TikTok was able somehow to appeal to his vanity, this idea that there were so many Zoomers who were proselytizing for Trump during the campaign, that seemed to be enough for him to be like, we're going to look at that ban, we're going to revisit it. And issue an executive order to have another 90 days for TikTok to work out something about its ownership structure. So I think that's why you see these tech CEOs ranging from true believers, or as sincere as his belief gets, Elon Musk, who I think does demonstrate far right political tendencies, to I think individuals like Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos, who have been quite happy to position themselves as liberals when it suited them. There's something I think incredibly interesting about what's happening right now, which is I think in 2016 there was a split amongst the economic elites, the plutocrats and the oligarchs. There was a genuine split amongst them about what's going to be better for looking out for their interest, Trump or Clinton. And of course, you could see all the reasons why Clinton would be beneficial for their interest. And also she represented business as usual. Now, Trump, while I think that he certainly is operating in the interests of the billionaire class, he certainly doesn't represent business as usual. He's volatile, he's thin-skinned, he expects displays of personal loyalty. And that makes him that little bit more difficult to work with. And I think that that's what accounted for some of that split amongst elites in 2016. I don't think it's because they were like, oh, yeah, we've really got to look out for democracy. I think they were trying to work out, all right, who's going to look out for us? Now, with Trump winning a second term, you've got the obvious weakness of the Democrats, and you've also got that sense of a real popular mandate for Donald Trump for the first time. They're having to all reinvent themselves as Trumpians. Something which I thought was instructive to make sense of our present moment is that I was re-listening to Mike Duncan's excellent podcast series, The History of Rome. And I was listening to the podcasts which cover the period between the end of the Second Punic War against Hannibal, who listeners may remember brought the elephants over the Alps, to the murder of Julius Caesar, and really thinking about what happened to democratic institutions during that time. It wasn't a one spectacular ending of the Roman Republic. What you had was a Senate which became less and less interested in delivering for the Roman people. You had Rome, which was becoming increasingly overcrowded and shabby as a city, had huge wealth disparities. And you had a Senate that was fundamentally uninterested in dealing with those things. The Senate wanted to preserve its own power and look out for its own interests. And then you had all these populists coming along who weren't interested in empowering ordinary Roman people. In fact, they were like, look, we're going to get rid of any semblance of democratic accountability. The Senate's not going to run things, but ultimately I'm going to look out for you guys. And that's one of the major reasons why the Roman Republic died. And I think that there are parallels and analogs to be drawn here, which is you had an American liberal establishment which had absolutely no interest in bettering the lives of ordinary American workers who are quite happy to oversee runaway levels of inequality, but also a sense of decline and a lack of optimism and a sense of, oh, look, this is as good as it's going to get. And so we've got populists coming along who are like, look, we don't actually give a shit about democratic processes or the rule of law. We're just going to behave as if it doesn't apply to us. But we're going to position ourselves as taking on this corrupt establishment. You can't then turn around and say, oh, well, this corrupt establishment really needs protecting. I think that there's something there which is useful to think about. And in particular, the way in which, at first Trump was looked at, I think, by some of these liberal elites as something of a class traitor. That was in 2016. Now you can see the billionaire class rallying around. I mean, I think that's just, it's hugely significant.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the tech billionaires, I mean, it's interesting. I was listening to a Slate podcast, I think it was, who was saying that when it came to Mark Zuckerberg, sort of the dominant narrative is that sort of he was a bit of a liberal and now he's bending the knee to Donald Trump. They were saying that actually sort of speaking to sources in Meta, is kind of the other way around. He was really kind of almost resented having to do all that sort of liberal hand-wringing, and now he feels like yeah, he can. I mean, he's always talking about his sort of masculine energy, isn't he? And how it's great to sort of reawaken masculine energy in businesses. Apparently, he was very frustrated with sort of the BLM movement and how that was sort of treated by staff members within Meta. And he's sort of embracing the opportunity to get rid of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which they have done already. So I think with lots of these tech billionaires, it's not so much necessarily bending the knee to Trump. It's that they finally feel liberated, that they can sort of out themselves for what they've kind of fought all along. I think in general, with the more popular vibe shift, the fact that there is just a much smaller mobilization of opposition to Donald Trump, which I'm very, sympathetic towards, really. I mean, it's tiring just constantly being sort of outraged and sort of saying this guy's illegitimate when he's sort of, he has won the popular vote. He's clearly won the election fair and square. But I suppose the thing which I worry about is there is a big overwhelming desire to treat him as a normal president. But he's not going to act like one, right? I think people are kind of thinking if we treat him like he's a normal president, he'll act like one. And he's not going to, that's not in his nature. And I think you got that from this speech as well. People, like the podcast I was listening to by liberals sort of saying, he needs to kind of do a Reagan, sort of say, let's all come together. It's, morning in America. He can do that. And everyone will let him do that this time. They'll go along with that. And people thought, if we let him be a happy, sunny president, maybe he'll do that. But no, the guy's an angry guy who really doesn't like immigrants, really, really wants tariffs, really, really likes drilling oil. All of these things, he does seem to genuinely believe, right?
No, I think you're so right. The reason why I was laughing is well, what if we manifest him being like a Ronald Reagan figure? Because that's what it boils down to, right? It's manifestation and it's tarot and it's hold the image in your mind's eye and maybe it will happen. I mean, that's the amount of integrity that kind of analysis has. I mean, Trump has everything that he wanted. Right? He has everything that he wanted. He even dropped these little hints on the campaign trail of becoming a president for a second time, maybe even a third. I don't know. He would do this sort of flirtatious, coyly approaching the line of being I'm not going to respect term limits, and then sort of coyly backing off again. He's someone who will see how much room he can crowbar for himself. That's who he's always been, and that's what he's always going to do. I don't think that the so-called Trump resistance did anything to rein him in, but I also don't think that this, liberal, manifestation board is going to do it either. I mean, the problem is that both of those things, I think, really speak to quite an elite theory of politics, where either way you're trying to go, how much do, well-off voters on the East Coast and the West Coast matter? And neither are looking at, well, how do you build a majority coalition against Trump? Well, for me, I think the answer would be embrace economic populism, left-wing economic populism, but also dealing with some of the real cultural and social tensions that would be involved in that coalition. The problem, I think, for the left and progressives often is that we go, all right, well, if we just tack economic populism onto some of our, social and cultural views, that'll be fine. I mean, maybe it won't be fine. And maybe we have to look at the real weaknesses of that kind of liberal identity politics, which has come to dominate all progressive politics. I mean, that's what I think that people should spend some time doing. I'm not sure how much anyone's going to take my advice, Michael.
Well, all I can say is I can't wait for you to bring me in a review copy of your book, because I think you go into some of these topics in it. And I hear from our colleague Aaron Bastani that it's excellent. The first phase of the Israel-Hamas ceasefire came into effect on Sunday, beginning the fragile process of permanently ending Israel's assault on Gaza. It was supposed to begin early in the morning. Instead, 19 Palestinians were killed across the Strip in Israeli attacks during a 3-hour delay to declaring a halt to the hostilities. A further 36 were injured. But just after 11 a.m. local time, Hamas delivered to Israel the names of the 3 hostages it would release, and the ceasefire took hold, marking the first period of relative peace in the Strip since a brief ceasefire in December 2023. In a video shared by Hamas, the 3 hostages are shown awaiting their return to Israel. 28-year-old Emily Damari, 24-year-old Romy Gonen, and 31-year-old Doran Steinbrecher also appear to have been handed goodie bags, reportedly containing gifts and souvenirs of their time in captivity. And they're also shown holding signed certificates of captivity. Hours later, the hostages, along with squadrons of Hamas fighters carrying guns and other weapons, arrived by car in Gaza City's Saraya Square for the handover. Amidst a large crowd of Palestinians chanting, "God is great," the fighters were met by several Red Cross vehicles carrying volunteers tasked with facilitating the handover. And this was the moment the hostages were transferred from Hamas to the Red Cross. In Israel, thousands viewed the handover on big screens in Tel Aviv. And there were scenes of jubilation in Israel as the three women crossed over the border from Gaza to Israel before being taken by helicopter to a medical center. Emotions were also understandably high as the three women saw their loved ones for the first time in well over a year, with family members gathering at a hospital in Tel Aviv to welcome their return. The three are just the first of 33 hostages expected to be released by Hamas over the next 42 days. Under the terms of the ceasefire, Israel will release 30 prisoners for each civilian hostage, rising to 50 prisoners for each female soldier released as the ceasefire continues. Upholding their end of the bargain, Israel duly released 90 Palestinian prisoners early on Monday morning. Before the release, hundreds of Palestinians gathered in the town of Beitunia near Ramallah in the occupied West Bank to welcome the freed prisoners. In an effort to disperse the crowds, Israeli soldiers intermittently fired tear gas and sound bombs at the crowd. But shortly after 1 a.m, a Red Cross bus carrying the prisoners released from the nearby Ofer prison arrived. Included in the release were 69 women, 8 boys and 12 men. Most had been jailed for fairly minor offences. There were scenes of joy and relief as family members were reunited with the prisoners, many of whom described ordeals involving the use of torture, degrading treatment and harassment at the hands of Israeli prison guards. This was freed prisoner Abdelaziz Atalneh speaking after his release.
I left hell, and now I'm in heaven. We are out of hell. They used to violate us, beat us. They used to count us while our heads were down on the floor. Suddenly, they would enter the cells and fire gas towards us. They would use bad words on us. There was no food, no sweets, no salt. There was nothing.
Among those released was Palestinian leader Khalida Jarrah, allegedly a member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. 61-year-old Jarrah was arrested during a violent raid on her home in December 2023 and has been held without charge since. According to Haaretz journalist Gideon Levy, Jarrah was held for months in continuous solitary confinement with only a thin mattress and a toilet that rarely flushed, forcing her to lie on the ground to breathe fresh air from under the cell's door. Describing her feeling on being released, Jarrah said this:
"Thank God he reunited me with them, and hopefully he will reunite us with their father, and joy spreads in the houses of all prisoners." We received news of the deal by chance. We heard about it, but we were not sure. The girls started to prepare themselves, thinking that we wanted to be ready, even if we might not get released. Then we were visited by the deputy of the head of the prison, and he told us to get ready in 10 minutes, and that some of us would be released. He was never nice to us, none of them were, but he tried to show some humanity at that point.
The next exchange of hostages is due to take place on Saturday. That's according to a Hamas spokesperson. Ash, I suppose very, very rare that you see joyous scenes from Israel-Palestine, especially over the last 15 months, seeing both hostages. And I mean, although, Palestinians say the Palestinian prisoners are also sort of hostages because they generally haven't been tried in any kind of fair way, often picked up for sort of nonsensical crimes. What do you make of these scenes we've seen over the past 24 hours or so?
One of the things that has really annoyed me is watching Israel's advocates and supporters online say, well, look at the ratio of Palestinian captives to Israeli hostages. This shows that it's Palestinians who don't value Palestinian life as highly as Israeli life, not Israel. The reason for the disparity in numbers is because Israel holds thousands of Palestinians in military detention, including children, including women, including people who've never been charged with any crime. And we call them prisoners because it's done by a recognized state's military. Whereas when you take captives, including children, including women, and you're not part of a recognized state, oh, well, those are hostages. Um, it's obviously incredibly moving. I don't think anyone can fail to be moved by footage of somebody experiencing freedom after months or years in captivity. Um, but when I see in particular the um, harrowed and emaciated faces of Palestinians who've been in Israeli military detention, it makes me feel incredibly angry at the position of our government in providing Israel with diplomatic cover, and also still continuing to sell arms and arms components to Israel. The treatment of Palestinians in Israeli military detention is often awful. I mean, you described the conditions of the Palestinian politician, but you can also read it on her face and on her body. What she'd went through was absolutely awful. When you look at the reports which have come from, an Israeli military torture camp in the desert, I'm going to absolutely butcher the pronunciation, so forgive me, but I believe it's something like Seda Tayman, but if someone could correct me, that would be great. The reports of sexual violence, of gang rape, of starvation, of torture. This is being done by the official army of a state who we happily call our allies. I know that there are people who would say, well, look how, look how well the hostages held by Hamas are treated. I'm always wary of that. The first thing is that there are many different trauma responses. There's fight, flight, freeze, which people may have heard of. There's also befriend. So people who are in a setting where they're being threatened, often one of the responses is to befriend the person who poses that threat. The other is I have no idea how intact a Hamas command structure was and how adhered to any orders to treat captives well would be taken. So I'm always wary of people making that argument. But I think one thing's for certain is that Palestinians who are held captive by Israel are subject to torture, are subject to rape, are subject to deprivation of food and sleep. And yet we don't consider Israel a terrorist actor. I mean, so yes, these are scenes of jubilation, but I personally feel an intense anger at our own government because of it.
Let's talk about another aspect of the ceasefire, and this will be very anger-inducing, because the ceasefire isn't just about prisoner exchanges or exchanges of captives. It also provides a window, perhaps even a permanent one, during which Palestinians in Gaza can return home, receive aid, and begin rebuilding some semblance of their lives. But that's going to be a struggle. But scenes of some of the worst devastation have begun emerging from northern Gaza's Jabalia refugee camp. Subject to months of repeated bombardments, there's little left of what was once the Strip's largest refugee camp, leaving its 100,000 former residents homeless. They aren't alone. According to the UN's Human Rights Office, 92% of Gaza's homes have been either destroyed or damaged in Israel's 15-month-long assault. Food, medicines, and other supplies have also been limited in the Strip since Israel's war began in 2023. Trucks carrying that much-needed aid have now begun to enter Gaza across the Rafah border with Egypt, with around 200 arriving on Sunday. That crossing is still under Israeli control, with the withdrawal of Israeli troops from the border only due to take place around the 50th day of the truce. So far, some 650 aid trucks have now arrived in Gaza, with at least 300 intended for the north of the Strip, where deprivation has been at its worst. Operations have also begun to recover bodies from under the enclave's rubble, with thousands of Palestinians thought to be buried beneath collapsed buildings. But while the situation looks bleak for those in Gaza, the Palestinian resistance appears steadfast. In a statement, Hamas have said this: Gaza, with its great people and its resilience, will rise again to rebuild what the occupation has destroyed and continue on the path of steadfastness until the occupation is defeated. Over the course of 471 days, the systematic crimes of the occupation have failed to dissuade our people and their valiant resistance from clinging to the land and confronting the aggression. Hamas fighters have also been appearing in public once more, and we saw a large Hamas presence during the release of the hostages in Gaza City on Sunday. But as Palestinians enter parts of Gaza previously occupied by the Israeli military, Hamas soldiers are returning too. These were the scenes of Khan Yunis shown in footage obtained exclusively by Novara Media. What you saw there were Hamas fighters out in the open being celebrated by crowds, calling out, amongst other things, Yahya Sinwar, we wish you were here. Yahya Sinwar, the former leader of Hamas, was killed by an Israeli drone in Gaza last October. Ash, I mean, sort of those scenes of cities completely destroyed, have shocked me over the weekend. I'm sure they've shocked many people. Interesting also sort of to see how, there's lots of speculation about how do Palestinians in Gaza feel about Hamas, because, on one level, it was Hamas's actions on October the 7th, which killed lots of civilians, which sort of was the immediate cause of the genocidal war that Israel launched into, which has cost so many lives. But on the other hand, people say, well, that's the only resistance that the Palestinians have. I suppose it's difficult to come to any conclusion about what Palestinians in Gaza in general think. But clearly some people see them as the legitimate resistance of the Palestinian people.
Well, I would be really, really interested in the coming weeks and months to read about what Hamas's command structure is like now, the extent to which it is able to maintain a fighting force, and to what extent it can still be a political actor in Gaza now that there is no government in Gaza. These are all questions which I hope that Novara can help address and look at in the coming weeks and months. But in terms of how Palestinians feel about Hamas, I think that it's very clear. Of course, Hamas, like any other, military government, has been very oppressive in Gaza, in particular. Fighting quite a brutal civil war against Fatah after the election nearly 18 years ago now. But the way in which Palestinians feel about Hamas is that the kind of overall polling of support has increased since the genocidal war rather than decreased. I think that it's clear that when it comes to Palestinians, at least in the West Bank, who've been polled, of course, you can't have, Salvation or Ipsos Mori functioning in Gaza in the context of a genocide, but certainly in the West Bank, opinion of Hamas improved because the sense of responsibility lay squarely with Israel for perpetuating a genocide. And while you can, I think, quite fairly talk about October 7th or Operation Al-Aqsa flood as a strategic misstep or based on some faulty assumptions by Hamas, one, the idea that Iran and Hezbollah would be well equipped to fight Israel. That's clearly not been the case. Another being that perhaps they underestimated the scale and severity of the response by the Israeli government. And also maybe there was a political misjudgment, which was that Netanyahu and his government would be held directly responsible for the security breach and that would ultimately destabilize the Israeli government. All those things, you might say were strategic miscalculations. But in terms of responsibility, Palestinians and many people globally, including myself, say, well, responsibility for perpetuating a genocide, it does rest squarely with Israel. And I think that when Israel has had no interest in negotiations with the Palestinians in any meaningful sense for decades, the offers made at Oslo weren't really for a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. And even when Hamas won the election and offered to be part of a negotiating party, but sort of, sitting as a junior partner to the Palestinian Authority, Israel said, no, absolutely not. So I think that there has been deliberately a strategy on Israel's part of impeding progress towards any kind of Palestinian state for decades now. And the Hamas military strategy and the sense that Palestinians have of going, well, at least they're fighting for us, that emerges within that context. I know that it's a moment of jubilation because there is a ceasefire. It means that the constant bombardment of Palestinian civilians in Gaza has at last, come to an end, at least temporarily. What my worry is that violence is inevitable. I think that Israel has absolutely no pressure to change its posture towards Gaza or the West Bank. I think what they've seen is the extent to which they can get away with. I think that what we're going to see is a return to the blockade, a return to essentially Gaza being turned into a form of open air prison, which makes a militant, violent response from militant groups in Gaza all but inevitable. And what Israel may have learned from the last year and a half is that maybe before they thought, okay, maybe you'll have a handful of Israelis. That means that we can kill, a few thousand Palestinians in Gaza. What now they've learned is that, they can wage a genocide and still be recipients of military aid and diplomatic cover from the world's superpowers. So I do have long-term concerns for the future. And I do think that more violence is all but inevitable because there's no pressure on Israel to pursue negotiations towards a Palestinian state.
I still can't see kind of any good outcome. I mean, I've seen sort of headlines of Trump still sort of considering plans to help people leave Gaza, which is what the Israelis want. I think I don't see how you rebuild a state which doesn't have a prominent role for Hamas unless you're going to have this sort of like insane sort of surveillance police state. And I don't see how they're going to build that either. So it's one of those situations where you can't really see any sort of sustainable solution, which makes it seem like, they're just going to continue making it up as they go along. The Israelis making it up as they go along, the international community making it up as they go along, and people sort of just being stuck in limbo, suffering greatly, of course. The man responsible for the horrific Southport attack last summer has pleaded guilty to the murder of 3 young girls. Elsie Stankham, age 7, BB King, age 6, and Alice Aguiar, age 9, were all murdered last July as they attended a Taylor Swift-themed dance class in Southport. Axel Rudakubana, aged 18 and pictured here in custody, has pled guilty to their murders, as well as the attempted murder of a further 8 children and 2 adults. The guilty plea came as a surprise to the judge and other observers. Rudakubana had already appeared in court numerous times without giving such a plea. And after hearing the guilty plea, the judge in fact apologised to the families of the victims as they were not in attendance. All had expected the trial itself to open tomorrow. Of course, that trial will no longer happen because he's pled guilty. The CPS prosecutor, though, Ursula Doyle, said she was relieved there had been a guilty plea.
The prosecution was determined to prove his guilt, and I'm deeply grateful that today's plea has spared the families at the heart of the case the pain of having to relive their ordeal through a trial. Today, our thoughts are with all those whose lives were altered by what happened on that day. Most of all, we think of Elsie, of Bibi, and of Alice, the 3 beautiful young girls whose lives were cut short.
The trial of Rudakubana had been expected to be extremely high profile, not just because of the harrowing nature of his crimes, but because it was also his attacks that led to days of far-right rioting across Britain. Those riots were fueled by false claims that Rudakubana was an illegal immigrant. And in recent months, there have been lots of suggestions of some sort of cover-up. Most prominently, these have come from Nigel Farage.
On Southport, all I can say to you right now is I know a hell of a lot more than the British public know. A hell of a lot more. I've been completely silenced. I dared, the day after Southport, to do a video to say, can we please know who this man is? Was he known to the authorities? Why do I feel we're not being told the truth? The level of demonisation I came under for that from both front benches was astonishing, from media commentators. Demonisation on a level that I'd never even experienced. Now I'm told by the Speaker of the House of Commons, I can't ask questions about it in the House of Commons. Parliamentary privilege is out of the window. Even rumours today that the court case, which is due in January, every effort is being made to defer it. Right? Yeah, this is what's going on. We are witnessing one of the biggest cover-ups we've ever seen in our lives. And I won't say any more than that. I genuinely would never wish to be in contempt of court. I have respect for our legal system. It's not perfect, but it's a damn sight better than most of the rest of the world.
That was Farage speaking last November. And there's been lots of other people sort of suggesting, I know loads more than we can tell the public, something, really, something is going on here which you're not being told. Farage there sort of saying the reason he can't say it is because of Britain's laws when it comes to contempt of court. I think he says there he agrees with these laws. It's that details of a court case and before any verdict has been reached can't be sort of discussed or detailed by the press in case it would influence any jury. But Nigel Farage, they're really suggesting that there's been some cover-up. There's all this information which will come out once those restrictions have been lifted. Now, with Radek Urbana pleading guilty, they have been lifted right now. So you would see all of this information flooding out. So what are we now discovering? Well, The Guardian has today reported that Radek Urbana had been referred to the counter-extremism scheme Prevent 3 times before he committed the attack. And on the face of it, this does make it seem surprising the police didn't initially call the Southport attack a terror offence. The reality, though, is actually a bit more complex than that. So this is from that Guardian article. Radek Urbana was first referred to Prevent over concerns he was looking at material about school massacres in the US and a fascination with violence. He used computers at the school he attended at the time to search for material on school massacres, it is understood. By early 2020, after the first referral the previous year, it was assessed that he did not fit the criteria for the voluntary scheme, but should be referred to other services. 2 years later, in 2021, he was referred again to Prevent after viewing material on Libya and past terrorist attacks, including those on London in 2017. The material is understood to have consisted of news articles, and at the time he was assessed by Prevent, officials did not have any information that he was viewing or searching for extremist material. On each occasion, it was decided that while the behaviour might be concerning, it did not meet the threshold for intervention by Prevent. He was judged 3 times not to pose a terrorism risk and was thus outside the scope of the scheme. Now, this might seem pretty odd. These clearly seem like sort of the actions or the searches of someone who is a risk to people, right? He seems to have a fascination with violence, and that was tragically borne out last summer. But the reason Prevent didn't act, apparently, is because they are a scheme specifically for people who hold terrorist ideologies. And Radek Urbana was judged not to have any sort of coherent ideological beliefs. So as The Guardian puts it, Prevent exists solely to stem the flow of recruits for terrorism, and there is no similar scheme for those thought to pose a risk of violence where terrorism is not suspected. Responding to this potential gap in the scheme, last month the Home Secretary Yvette Cooper announced a review into the threshold for intervention by Prevent, and she said this: "A lack of clarity remains over whether Prevent should be confined to cases of clear ideology or should also be picking up cases where the ideology is less clear or where there is a fixation with violence." In the case of Radek Urbana, there's sort of another element here which makes it even more confusing, which is that while the Southport attacks themselves were not judged to be an act of terrorism because they didn't have an ideological motive, he has pled guilty to separate charges of terrorism offences. This is from The Guardian. Radek Urbana pleaded guilty to a terrorism offence, possessing a document called Military Studies and the Jihad Against the Tyrants, the Al-Qaeda training manual, and also producing the biological toxin ricin. Police say that despite extensive searches and investigation, there is no evidence of a terrorist motivation for the Southport attack. Ash, this case, I mean, you can see why it has sort of built up do I want to call them conspiracy theories or so much speculation around it and so much sort of talk of a cover-up? Now, of course, above all, this is a tragic, horrific murder or mass murder. You know, lots of families' lives destroyed, 3 young girls killed. Politically, what we're seeing here is sort of an argument being made by people like Nigel Farage that this person was, I suppose, an ideological terrorist, and to try and maintain social order, the state have covered that up. Now, you could see how sort of someone sort of reading some of the basics of this, thinking, well, he's been done for a terrorist offence. He had sort of one jihadist manual, and Prevent had sort of come and tried to enroll him 3 times or whatever. They say, well, clearly he's, you know, terrorist adjacent at the very least. But I think if the police are saying that, you know, the police had access clearly to everything, you know, all his computers, anything he'd ever written, right? And they say, well, this guy wasn't ideologically motivated. He just had a fixation with violence. And I suppose both politically in terms of sort of discourse around this, and it seems also legally in terms of Prevent and how it operates, that division between an ideological motivated mass killing and a non-ideologically motivated mass killing seems to be very important, even though I suppose for a viewer it might seem somewhat arbitrary.
I don't want to go running in with an analysis, which then might be changed by rapidly evolving circumstances. As you mentioned, the guilty plea, which was entered today, came as a surprise even to the judge. And it might be the case that more information will be forthcoming after the sentencing. And that there had been a sense amongst police forces and the Crown Prosecution Service of when to release information to the public, and had maybe anticipated it would be a bit later. So I'm just suggesting that there might be something more, and that I don't want to go sort of racing in and being definitive one way or another about ideological motivation. From the information which is available to us at the moment, the lack of coherent ideology clearly isn't the same as determining whether or not someone is a threat. And I think that this has been an issue with Prevent, which is that it was designed with a very particular kind of violence in mind. It was designed within the context of the war on terror. And that's in part why it focuses so much on what you would call non-violent extremism. So expressing ideas which could be interpreted as being hostile to or antithetical to British values. Now, this was so widely and broadly interpreted that you had a Muslim master's student, I believe, who was, called in under Prevent because he was reading a book about terrorism. Now, it just so happened that his master's was in terrorism and security studies. And if you define threat as someone who, expresses a sort of coherent ideology, whether it's, a jihadist ideology or a neo-Nazi one, you're going to miss out on, I would say a substantial number of people who have a fascination with violence. And perhaps one of the reasons why they engage with material which is, terrorist or glorifying terrorism one way or another isn't necessarily because they're attracted to the ideology, but because they're attracted to violence. And it's a problem if this very, very wide net that we have, bringing in lots of people, is essentially throwing fish back into the sea because they weren't ideological enough. It seems that you get the worst of both worlds through that process, which is one, you've got this wide net dragging everyone in, effectively criminalizing people for completely lawful and non-violent behavior. And on the other hand, that when you do come across someone who's got a real fascination with violence, you're going, oh, well, their ideas don't make much sense, so we're going to chuck them back in. Now, in the news article that you referred to, it said that Rada Kubana was referred to other services. I don't know what those services might have been. I don't know if they were sort of criminal justice in nature. I don't know if they're more focused on mental health. But I think either way, you've got this, what I'm concerned could be an increasing problem, which is you've got a perfect storm of atomization, access to the internet, young male disaffection, and the ability to access very, very violent materials. I'm worried that we don't have a system in place to identify and categorize threat effectively. We've got one way of looking at it, which is terrorism. And then for everything else, it's like, don't know.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. That sort of, I mean, I'm sometimes skeptical of, there's people on the left who sort of say, get rid of prevent, all of all of this. We need to sort of really make sure that sort of civil liberties are front and center, and we shouldn't be looking at what people are searching. Now, I do feel like, this guy, it would have been good if he was stopped sooner, right? If people might say, well, it's a bit creepy that he was just sort of reading about school shootings and then, reading about what was going on in Libya, and that shouldn't suggest someone is necessarily guilty of a crime, right? Being interested in stuff, but that does seem like it's fair enough to have some warning signs there, and then for be brought into an interview. And I think lots of prevent on the when it comes to Islamist or far right sort of extremism seems to function a bit like that. I feel like there is probably space for some kind of scheme such as that. But I think you probably hit the nail on the head there, where it should be much more attuned to who seems violent than who seems very ideological. And at the moment, it seems like it. Go on.
Just very quickly on the point about prevent. One of the problems of prevent, though, is that because it gives the statutory obligation basically to anyone who works in the public sector, is that it also encourages a degree of racial profiling. So this is the problem. It's not the idea that, when I was working as a lecturer, that I had a statutory obligation to report people who I thought were a threat. That's fine. I mean, that's a sort of socially responsible thing to do. If I think that any of my students are axe-wielding maniacs, I probably have a duty of care, to the community and also to them to some degree, to be like, I should probably report this. The problem with prevent is that it encouraged a way of looking, at students in particular, because my experience was within higher education, but this also is the case in secondary education as well, is that it encouraged a sort of a disposition of suspicion, right? Which, when you have kind of problems of ingrained bias or racism, it means that certain people are allowed to have curiosity and interest and try out ideas, and other kinds of people are put under the microscope, and everything that they say or do is interpreted through the most outlandish frame possible. So another example was a primary school child, who drew a picture of his dad cooking. So he was like pictured in front of a pot, and I think he either was holding a cucumber or possibly a knife. And he was like, "Oh my God, this child's dad is a jihadist." And that's something where you go, well, this is completely insane. So for me, the problem isn't, do people who work in the public sector have a statutory obligation to report threats? Yes, absolutely. The problem with the framing of prevent is because it was like, be on the lookout for terrorists, is that it automatically meant that certain kinds of children and young people were viewed with suspicion for doing really benign things. So that's my problem with prevent.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. We should be looking out for people with violent tendencies. Even, I suppose the thing I suppose the thing I'm less concerned about than some people is sort of them knowing everything you're searching, that kind of thing, right? If people are searching for loads of sort of like, how do I do X violent thing? I don't really mind the state kind of knowing.
I don't want people to know how much I look at videos where like dogs and cats have become friends. I don't want people to know how much I rely on those videos to preserve my mental health.
I don't think that's going to get you put on any kind of watch list. I watch lots of those as well. More than 70 people were arrested at a Palestine Solidarity Campaign protest held on Saturday, including PSC Director Benjamin Jamal, who we interviewed on Friday. 2 MPs have also attended voluntary interviews under caution with the Met Police. They are, no prizes for guessing, John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn. So what led to the arrests? Well, they follow an alleged breach of public order conditions set by the Met before the event took place. The police had originally banned the march from starting at the BBC, supposedly due to its proximity to a synagogue. We spoke to Ben on Friday about why that seemed a bit unnecessary. After wrangling about routes, the police and PSC agreed there would be a static rally at Whitehall, but police claim there was a coordinated attempt to breach those conditions. So the Met Police tweeted this on Saturday afternoon. They said, officers were holding the line at the top of Whitehall to stop any groups marching, which would be a breach of the conditions. Despite their efforts, a large group has forced its way through and are in Trafalgar Square. More officers are being deployed. The Met soon followed that tweet with this update. The group that forced its way through the police line is now held at the northwest corner of Trafalgar Square. Anyone in that group should now disperse and leave the area. Anyone remaining in breach of the conditions or inciting further breaches will be arrested. The Palestine Solidarity Campaign, though, in response, has posted footage which they say conflicts with the police's narrative. They posted parts of Ben Jamal's speech which preceded people approaching the police line.
The leaders of each of these groups and our speakers today, who you see lined up behind me, and members of the Jewish bloc, will now walk as a delegation towards the BBC. We will carry with us flowers that we intend to lay at the gates of the BBC. So we will walk peacefully. We will walk in silence. If the police stop us, which they probably will, we will lay those flowers at the feet of the police force to mark their complicity in supporting genocide by suppressing protest against that genocide.
The PSC then say this in a tweet. The delegation walked peacefully up to the police line at Whitehall with their flowers and requested to be let through. Our footage clearly shows the police choosing to beckon them through. Now, this is part of the footage attached to that tweet. So what you saw there was a line of fairly elderly-looking people holding flowers. And it did look like, you did sort of see there an officer seeming to beckon at least some of them through. Ash, before I sort of go to you, I should sort of point out to our audience, because some people involved in this have been charged, that means this is a live case, and for legal reasons we can't speculate about what crimes may or may not have been committed here. That would be contempt of court. Ben Jamal in particular has been charged with inciting people to fail to comply with conditions on a protest. We absolutely can't pass any judgment on that because it's a live case, not because we may or may not have opinions, right? But just from that clip, this is what I want us to focus on. Whether you think it was appropriate for the police to say in that tweet that protesters forced their way through a police line, because if you're a general member of the public and you read sort of people force their way through, you don't really imagine a line of elderly people holding flowers and then a policeman seeming to sort of beckon people through.
I don't know. I think I may have detected a disappointed look from John McDonnell there, which, as we all know, has the same concussive force as, pushing and shoving and fighting your way through. I mean, look, obviously we can't comment on the live cases, but just to take a step back for a moment and have a look at why the Metropolitan Police said that people weren't allowed to protest outside the BBC, which, by the way, had been a gathering point for many of the pro-Palestine demonstrations since October the 7th. They said that, well, there's a synagogue nearby. Now, obviously, people should feel safe to worship anywhere in London. There have been no threats that I know of against this synagogue. There have been no reports of people being threatened while trying to worship at the synagogue on prior mobilizations. There was no service which was scheduled at the same time as this march. It, in fact, ended quite some time before this march was supposed to begin rallying at the BBC. So when you look at all those things together, I think that you could come to one of two conclusions. One is that apparently places of worship are supposed to be so sacred that not only should they themselves be protected, but, a radius of multiple city blocks ought to also be protected, which is going to be difficult in London, which, many of our listeners and viewers don't live here. But let me tell you, it's a very densely populated city. There's a lot of places of worship here. and this is what I think, what you have is the police choosing, I think, to mobilize a particularly, I think, venal form of identity politics, where what you do is you sort of, identify a minority group and then you hide behind them to try and achieve an authoritarian goal. In this case, suppress the right to protest. I think it's difficult to imagine that every protest would be looked at in the same light, that if there's a place of worship within a block or two, that means that protest won't be able to rally there. I think this is all about suppressing the right to protest and trying to wind down on the pro-Palestine movement now that there is a ceasefire. I mean, I think that it's safe to say that the British state wants its complicity in the genocide not to be particularly scrutinized. And I think they just hope that we can all move on from this very nasty business.
Yeah, I mean, we spoke to Ben actually on Friday's show, and I think he did speak very articulately about why he wanted to be quite careful not to sort of cause sort of a public order disruptive event, because he thought that in a way that might serve the purposes of the government and the police. Keir Starmer being called two-tier Keir. Sorry, I don't know why I drew a complete blank there. Two-tier Keir. And so they were actually kind of angling for sort of an opportunity to have a tough response against pro-Palestinian protests to show we can also do, tough policing of the left. Of course, that image, another thing you compare that image to, and again, I don't think this actually even does relate to the cases, because I think the cases aren't about whether force was used. It's just, did you breach the conditions? We're not going to talk about that. We've just explained why. But in terms of people trying to sort of compare how different groups are policed and say, oh, you go really soft on the right wingers and you go really hard on the right wingers, and really soft on the left wingers. Remember the last protest where there were sort of public order conditions on Whitehall was when the image of that was like Tommy Robinson and all his gang. I mean, I think Tommy Robinson might have left by then, but sort of Tommy Robinson got his gang all down there, didn't they? And then they all looked kind of coked up. They're all sort of like really fighting with the police. And yeah, then some of them got arrested. On the left, you've got like some old people with flowers sort of walking up really gently. And then they're like, why aren't you sort of like wrestling them to the floor like you did with the right? And it's because they're completely different people who behave very, very differently. Like, why aren't the police battening old people with flowers as much as they batten young people trying to punch them? Right? It's kind of obvious, the answer, isn't it? Any final comments on this, Ash?
No, just that I think it's going to be... I think that we're going to see increasingly authoritarian measures being used to curtail the right to protest. I think we're going to be seeing them used against the left in particular. And it's something which there's not going to be much political pressure on Keir Starmer, particularly coming from mainstream media on this, because ultimately they all agree with it. Ultimately, they see someone like Jeremy Corbyn being interviewed under caution. They're like, well, to your right, I've always thought he was a wrong one. And this is one of the problems with British media culture, which is there is no real value of either the rule of law or proportion of, a proportionateness of response, or a sense of having to, balance different freedoms against each other. All there is political convenience. And unfortunately, because, the pro-Palestine cause has the misfortune of being associated with both the left and Jeremy Corbyn, you're going to have so many newspaper columnists being like, lock him up, throw away the key.
Well, they can't say that now. Well, they can, because he hasn't been charged. They can't say that about people who've been charged, because that would be contempt of court. But I think because Corbyn and McDonnell haven't been charged, they can still write those columns. Ash, thank you for joining me tonight. So much to talk about.
So much to talk about. And just very, very quickly, RIP to El Gato. Pour one out for the little furry homie.
Is that confirmed? I saw that in the comments that Jeremy Corbyn's cat has died.
It is confirmed. It is confirmed.
What a difficult weekend that man's had. Very sad news there. Let's wrap up. Come back tomorrow from 6 p.m, of course, for another episode of Novara Live. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.